So my name is Dr. Miles Neale, and I want to first just acknowledge Embodied Philosophy for hosting this platform, and Jacob Kyle for putting all the energy into creating an environment of learning and opportunity for different speakers to provide perspective on Buddhism. And I hope to contribute more from the psychotherapy lens and clinical side of mindfulness meditation. The talk that I want to give is something that I've been thinking about for 5-6 years now. The talk is called Beyond McMindfulness. McMindfulness is a term I coined in 2010 as a kind of critique of our cultural situation or context in which meditation had been extrapolated from Eastern traditions and really gone mainstream. And for all the utility and great science and health benefit that it was producing, I was also very struck by the commodification, for example, of the practice, and the dilution, potential dilution, and the mass marketing and the sort of promotion and promise of it being a panacea to society, which I thought was troubling and less a comment on the actual technique and more a comment on culture. So in this talk, what I want to do is really talk about like mindfulness 3 ways, if you will. McMindfulness, which is my critique on culture. Secular mindfulness, which is a viable human endeavor to make available technologies that will really have positive health outcome. And Buddhist mindfulness, which is really talking about mindfulness in its traditional context in contemplative science of India in the Buddhist tradition, and really showing the pitfalls of McMindfulness, the benefits of secular mindfulness, and the real promise of what Buddhist practice is. And my hope is that way to really educate people who are just newcomers and being introduced to mindfulness, that they'll have really an educated, informed avenue into what they're practicing. So let me start with, again, defining McMindfulness. Maybe we'll start with McMindfulness. So McMindfulness in my article, which is available on my website, and I'm sure Jacob will make available to you, is the extrapolation or the extraction, the dilution, the commodification, and the mass marketing of a technique from India, the Satipatthana technique of the Buddha. And there's a whole historical context about how we got here doing that with this technology. And I'm not a student or a scholar of history, so I have a probably very simplified view, but I do want to offer some context to how did we get here. And I think probably the best way to start is to think about what's happening in Europe in the 17th and 18th century with the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, the so-called Enlightenment, not the Buddhist Enlightenment, but the European Enlightenment. And philosophically, what's happening there is an enormous tension between what had been there, the predominant paradigm of religiosity. And the Age of Reason is really a pushback against the centralized control of the religious dominance and the bastardization of religion really to dominate itself over people. And you can see how it's a useful counter backlash or counter culture to have a whole people push back against the centralized government of the Catholic Church and aspire for a new way of thinking, which included reason, essentially. Stop telling us things that we have to believe in. Let me see the truth. And that's what science is. Science enters in at that point as an alternative to religion, and what we see there in history is the first real departure, a split, a fragmentation, if you will, where an alternative is provided to the centralized belief system of religiosity as a centralized controlling factor, and science, which offers a whole new avenue of understanding the world, of being critical and being rational. And that offshoot carries us in through the centuries into great advances which cannot be denied, such as commerce, globalization, technology, advances in medicine. All of those things increase the quality and standard of living, for example, and they're not to be denied. In other words, I'm not making a critique that happened. I'm saying it was an essential backlash to to a kind of impoverishment or imprisonment of so many living beings. But also there's a dark side at that split, at that crossroad, and the dark side is relevant to how we get to McMindfulness, because scientific split leads to what's called materialism or reductionism. The scientific paradigm is about essentializing everything and giving credence only to the senses that can perceive certain things. We're done with the realm of belief and spirituality, and spirit means, things that we cannot perceive. And we're into things that we can perceive, reduce, essentialize, and control or master. And that materialistic, reductionistic, scientific paradigm becomes the pervasive paradigm that carries us all the way into modern life. And I believe, in part, it is one of the main, it is responsible for some of the pervasive dissatisfaction we as Westerners experience. And by that, what I mean by that is, if you look at our culture right now, we have advances in technology, we have an enormous amount of wealth, we have medicine unbelievable, we can fly to the moon, we can globalize the entire planet with our telecommunications. But essentially, we are starved as human beings. As a psychologist, I see a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety, and fundamentally my critique of it is that as human beings we have become so separated. And we've become so fragmented. In agricultural societies, human beings live together, not just in pair bonds, but in group bonds. And that really helped child rearing and created what's called in attachment research in psychology, secure attachment. There's a secure attached base with extended family networks. Agricultural societies lived together. There was either a grandparent around or another person. Children always had the abundance of care and attention. When you get into industrialized civilization, corporatization, commodification, fragmentation, materialism, you have more than one person trying to breadwin for the family. You have now two partners trying to work endlessly to pay enormous rents. Children are essentially abandoned emotionally at the very least. And so, and you can see it, we're filming right now from New York City. We live in tight little quarters, endlessly stressed out by trying to earn a living. We don't know our neighbors. We live alone. We so-called live amongst millions of people and utterly alienated. And even the promise, I have a critique of the promise of technology to connect us. I am one of those people that don't believe that Facebook connects us. I think it offers the illusion of connection, but I actually don't think it gives the depth and quality that human beings seek and need for real thriving. And I think that is one of the dark sides, shadow sides of this departure into science and materialism and reductionism and industrialization. It has left us utterly kind of spiritually anorexic, really, really starved for connection, because there's nothing beyond what appears to us. We don't have a connection with the divine. We don't have a connection with our internal world, with our psyche, with our soul, with our spirit, whatever word you want to throw on it. Because it's not seen with the senses, it has been radically abandoned, and we have thrown out we've thrown out religious or spiritual avenues in terms of a secularization, and it has left us kind of deprived. So that's how we get to this context where we are yearning as a human society. For example, I'll speak strictly from an American point of view, and this is again my critique, and I'm sure there are many people that might have a contrary opinion, which I'm happy to debate at another point. But I think we are absolutely yearning and hungry. And suddenly, because of a historical landmark sequence of events that brings Asian technology west, we have now available to us yoga, meditation, prayer, mysticisms of different sorts. But we have a kind of shopping cart mentality with them. We walk in the lines of the shopping or the supermarket and we have 50 different kinds of cereal. And we do that in the spiritual world too. There's a spiritual marketplace, and because of technology and proximity and interfaith dialogue and cross-cultural collaboration, there's a plethora of options. But our predilection underneath is so superficial and so base and is all centered around pleasure principle, for example. Even though there's a deep yearning, we're not really aware what we're really yearning for. We've been misled by the senses to presume that satisfying our pleasure principle is really the key to happiness. So what I would say is everybody wants happiness, but we have been pre-programmed to believe that happiness is by way of senses. And so everybody's really trying to get theirs in all kinds of ways, even when it comes to the spiritual community. So that's why yoga is a calisthenic exercise regime, and meditation is a stress reduction or pleasure-pleasing experience, not dissimilar to having a drink or taking a luxurious workshop or going on a vacation or having a nice meal. Essentially, they're all gratifying the same thing. And so that's what my critique of McMindfulness is that there is a segment of our culture that jumped on a bandwagon, procured certain technologies from Asia, extrapolating them from their original context, diluting them from their comprehensive scientific systems, reducing and commodifying them, making them commercialized assets to feed the hunger and the yearning of people's pleasure interest, and then mass marketing them as a panacea to our hysterical society. And that's an edgy kind of critique, but I'm going to stand by it just to sort of be provocative. And I think then what happens is that people jumped on it. And I think, if I look at my own personal life, maybe I can transition from that larger global historical perspective into just one minute myopic perspective of my own journey. I was raised with some means. You can say I was raised in a fortunate situation. My parents were business-minded people, and I was raised in Hong Kong, but with a secular kind of family ethos. There wasn't any religion at all. And, there was alcoholism in my family and abuse, and I sustained what I would consider my own traumas. And I was hungry for answers, and I couldn't find it neither in the secular world nor in the business world. All the trips my family gave me, all the money and the resources and the education, nothing was really, really feeding me. So by the time I was in high school, I was really searching and unsatisfied with what my culture had presented as the options to a so-called satisfying life. I had already exhausted them and found them unsatisfying, and was really looking for something else. And so I found very early on, and very thankfully, I found several teachers in my high school who were spiritual teachers, essentially, in the guise of, standard Western curriculum educators. But they were born missionaries in India, for example. Another one was a transpersonal psychologist, one was a psychotherapist, and one was a Buddhist teacher. And we would go on hikes together in the mountains outside of the city of Hong Kong, and we would sit and we would peel an orange and we would share it together, and we'd discuss philosophy, and we would discuss meaning making, and we would discuss the hero's journey, and we would discuss holotropic breath work and transpersonal dimensions of consciousness. And at 16 and 17, I felt fed for the first time in my life. That orange split amongst 5 peers was a metaphor for finally being fed, finding my family, finding an avenue into my psyche, into my soul. And so that journey carried on into college, where I met another, unbelievable mentor who was at the time a psychoanalyst from Harvard, but had spent 5 or 6 years in a Zen monastery in Korea. And he was probably my first introduction to an eclectic, integrative, combined approach between East and West that actually respected the depth and integrity of both traditions and wasn't merely content to stay at a superficial level. He introduced me into Zen meditation. He would bring me on my days off from school into the Zen monastery. We would sit and we would conceive ideas about what my college experience could be like. And we actually got entry into what was called at the time a Wheaton Scholar program, which allowed me to do an independent study for my college curriculum. I basically scratched college, developmental curriculum and invented my own curriculum. And the first book he gave me, that was Professor Sprosty, a Zen psychologist. He gave me a book when I was 18 or 19 years old. It was hot off of the press at the time, called Thoughts Without a Thinker by Dr. Mark Epstein, which was 1995, I believe. And that was if there was one instant turning point in my life that I would trace it to that. Dr. Mark Epstein's book, Thought Without a Thinker, was the first book on Buddhist psychotherapy. And I call myself a Buddhist psychotherapist now, years later, because of that book. And that book introduced me into a whole way of seeing that was so rich into the science of Buddhism, into karma theory, the wheel of life, into emptiness, into its application into the psychotherapeutic world, into trauma, addiction. It was so profound that it really inspired my whole hero's journey as an independent scholar, creating a curriculum for my college journey. And so what I ended up doing was deciding to go to India for a 6-month period to study Buddhism at its roots in a Buddhist monastery in India in a place called Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha gained enlightenment. And I would complement that by coming home and going to study at Harvard at a meditation lab, probably the first of its kind, called the Mind-Body Institute. And that was pioneered by Dr. Herbert Benson. And I would combine those two studies as kind of field research for a dissertation that I would write in my undergraduate thesis. And so what I found was this is again my personal sort of journey, just to give you a little sense of this sort of overarching place and time where we are. I went to India. I lived in a Buddhist monastery with Buddhist monks and other students from America that were who had self-selected to do a deep immersion, weren't interested in a superficial thing, wanted to go right to the source. We were right there where the Buddha gained enlightenment himself, studying in a Buddhist monastery with monastics, waking up at 4:30 to do meditation, studying the philosophy. Our anthropological classes were going to the Zen temple, going to the Bhutanese temple, going to the Thai temple, going to the Japanese temple, going to the Tibetan temple. That was our anthropological study. It was an unbelievable, mind-blowing experience. But the single most important encounter of my life was my encounter with my teacher. My first teacher was a lay vipassana teacher, insight meditation teacher from Sri Lanka. His name was Godwin. And Godwin had two teachings, and they weren't esoteric at all. They were very straightforward, and they were very simple, and they were so compelling and so moving. His first teaching was on sati, mindfulness. His second teaching was on metta, loving kindness. And he was so approachable and so down to earth and had such a loving energy and opened his arms. And I felt, for the first time in my life, truly seen, understood, loved in all my insecurities, with all my fears and anxieties, with all my traumas. There wasn't someone trying to analyze me. There wasn't someone trying to make it all better. There wasn't someone trying to deny it. There wasn't someone trying to shame it. There was just presence love. What Tsoknyi Rinpoche is now in his latest book called Presence Love. So beautiful. And I fell in love with Godwin. And I remember we would walk hand in hand, as is very common in Indian culture, two men to walk hand in hand in the darkness, 4:30 in the morning, in the village trail that would lead to the tree of enlightenment. We'd walk hand in hand without talking through the night and the early morning until we got to the tree where the Buddha sat, and we would sit together, not speaking. It was all about presence love, and we would meditate there until the sun came up.